I have built churches and schoolhouses and homes that have stood through Tennessee storms for 20 years. I know what it sounds like when something breaks on purpose. At 2:38 in the morning, that sound came from inside my own house. My son-in-law was crouched over my filing cabinet. My daughter stood beside him with my life's work in her arms. Behind me, a voice whispered, "Already called it in. 2 minutes." That night tore open a secret buried since the day my daughter was born. Before we begin, I want to thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. What city? What country? I love knowing who is in this room with me. Some elements of this story have been shaped for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is worth every word. The window gave way at exactly 2:38 in the morning. Not the soft pop of a branch blown against the siding. Not the rattle of October wind working loose a shutter. This was a different sound entirely. A heavy, deliberate crack, followed by the low grind of metal twisting against a wooden frame. I had spent 32 years in construction. I had built load-bearing walls and torn them down again. I had pulled nails from beams older than my grandfather. I knew the language of materials under stress, the way a musician knows a wrong note before the phrase is finished. And what I heard, rising through the bones of my house on Fatherland Street, was not an accident. It was intention. I did not move. I lay flat on my back in the dark, eyes open, and I listened. Nashville goes quiet in the small hours of autumn, the particular kind of quiet that lives between the last bar closing on Broadway and the first delivery truck rolling down Gallatin Road. The kind of quiet that turns every sound into something you cannot set aside. And what came drifting up from the first floor were two voices, low and careful and familiar in a way that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I was not surprised. That was the strangest part of all. Somewhere beneath the cold clarity of that moment, I realized I had been waiting for this night. Maybe not this exact night, but something shaped like it. Something that felt, when it finally arrived, less like a shock and more like a conclusion I had watched forming from a long way off. The way you watch a crack spread through a foundation and know, even before the inspector arrives, that the damage goes all the way down. Grace was already awake beside me. I could tell by her breathing, too steady, too controlled for sleep. Her hand found mine beneath the sheets, without a word. She squeezed once. I squeezed back. Then I sat up. The bedroom doorway filled with a shape. Broad. Moving without sound. James Calloway, 62 years old. Retired master carpenter. And the man I had called at 11 on a Tuesday night 2 months earlier, when I first understood what was coming. He had shown up the next morning with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, walked into the guest room at the end of the hall, and set it on the bed without asking a single question. That was Big Jim, 35 years of friendship, and he still did not need things explained twice. He looked at me now and kept his voice to a breath. Already called it in. 2 minutes out. I nodded. I stood. Clifford. Grace's fingers caught my wrist, not pulling me back, just holding on for 1 second. The way you press your hand against a wall before you walk through a door you are not sure about. Lock the door behind us, I told her. She let go. Big Jim and I moved into the hallway without turning on a single light. I knew every board of that floor by memory. 19 years in this house will teach a man where to step and where not to. The same way 19 years of building teaches you which joints hold and which ones only look like they do. We stopped at the top of the staircase and looked down into the glow leaking from my office at the end of the first floor hall. The door was open. I never left it open. Through it came the particular sound of drawers being slid from their runners, the rustle of paper being sorted with purpose, the careful clatter of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and did not intend to stay long enough to be found looking. Then voices. Clearer now. It has to be in the bottom drawer. The blueprint folder. Blue tab on the left side. Travis. Tight and focused. like a man running a job site, not committing a crime. Then another voice. Lower. Closer to the door. Just get the property blueprints. All of them. We don't have long. Brooke. My daughter. I had heard that voice every week for 28 years. I knew the rhythm of it. The way it sharpened when she was nervous. The particular way it flattened when she was trying to sound calm, and was not. She was not calm now. I reached over and found the hallway light switch. I did not flip it yet. I rested my fingers against the plastic plate and held them there. Big Jim looked at me. I looked at the staircase. Below us, the glow from the office shifted as a shadow crossed it. Travis. Moving toward the filing cabinet along the far wall, I heard the metallic bite of a crowbar settling into the seam of the bottom drawer. I flipped the switch. Light flooded the staircase and poured down into the hallway below. The sounds from the office stopped. Every sound stopped. For one full second, the house held its breath, and so did everyone inside it. Then I walked downstairs, one step at a time, slowly. I wanted them to hear me coming. I wanted the weight of each footfall to land in the silence, the way a sentence lands when there is nothing left to say after it. Big Jim came behind me, his footsteps so quiet for a man his size that only someone who had worked beside him for 3 decades would know he was there at all. I stepped into the doorway of my office. Travis was on the far side of the room, crouched beside the filing cabinet with a crowbar in his right hand. The bottom drawer was half open. He straightened fast when the light reached him. For one fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Something that might have been shame on a different man. Then, it was gone, replaced by the particular steadiness I had come to recognize over 2 years of Sunday dinners and firm handshakes and compliments that never quite reached past the surface. Brooke was standing 3 feet from the desk. She was holding a stack of my project blueprints against her chest. Original architectural drawings, property surveys, structural plans, 30 years of work pressed against the jacket I had given her the Christmas before last. Her hair was loose. Her eyes, when they found mine, went wide. Not with guilt, with the sharp recognition that the distance between what she had planned and what was actually happening had just collapsed entirely. The room was still. The kind of still that has weight to it. "Dad," she started. "Don't." One word. She stopped. Big Jim filled the doorway behind me. Travis looked at the crowbar in his own hand, then at Big Jim, then set it down on top of the cabinet. The metal against wood made a small, clean sound that carried further than it should have. Outside, already, the sirens. That long, rising wail of a Nashville PD cruiser moving through empty streets, bending through the October air, the way sound does when nothing else competes with it. Travis heard it too. His jaw tightened. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. The smoothness came back into his voice like a reflex. "If you will just let us explain, we can sort this out without involving anyone else. The cameras have been running since the glass broke," I said. 16 of them. Everything in this room, all of it recorded and stored off-site where neither of you can reach it. The smoothness left his face for good. What remained was something smaller and harder. A man who had just realized that the structure he had been building in the dark had been visible the entire time. I looked at Brooke. I looked at her. The way you look at someone when you are searching for something you are afraid is no longer there. Her hands around my blueprints were trembling, not the trembling of cold. The trembling of a person who has arrived at the exact place they were heading and discovered it looks nothing like what they imagined. I searched. I genuinely searched. For the girl who used to draw houses on her bedroom wall and label them with my name. For the child who stood on a step stool beside her mother every Sunday and poured chocolate chips into cookie batter with the seriousness of a surgeon. For the young woman who cried into the phone the night her childhood cat did not come home from a February evening that turned cold too fast. I did not find her. What I found instead was fear. Undecorated, self-preserving fear. The kind with no guilt underneath it, only the rapid calculation of what comes next. Blue and red lights swept through the broken window, painting slow stripes across my office walls. Brooke looked down at the blueprints. Then she set them on my desk. Carefully. The way you set something down when you know it is the last time you will touch it. Detective Paula Reeves arrived with 2 patrol units, 4 minutes and 22 seconds after Big Jim's call. She assessed the room in 10 seconds, asked Big Jim one question about the sequence, then moved to Travis. The arrest was efficient and undramatic in the way real arrests tend to be when the evidence is already secured. Reeves placed them both in handcuffs in the hallway, while the kitchen light hummed above them and the broken glass on the office floor caught the beam from a patrol officer's flashlight. Brooke looked at me when Reeves guided her toward the front door. Not at Grace, who had come downstairs and stood at the far end of the hall with her arms folded and an expression I had seen only once in 26 years of marriage. Not at the floor. At me. I held her gaze, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the expression of a man who had loved someone for 28 years and was still loving them even now, even here, even as the handcuffs caught the porch light. I do not know if she understood that. I stood on the front porch and watched the cruisers move down Fatherland Street in the dark. One set of taillights, then another, then silence. Grace came out and put her hand on my shoulder. The October air carried wood smoke and the particular stillness Nashville holds before dawn. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I don't know yet." She was quiet for a beat. "She looked at you when they walked her out." "I know." She didn't look at me. I heard what was underneath those words. 28 years of mornings, of step stools and flour-dusted counters, of a name spoken through a bedroom door on Saturday market mornings. "What happens now?" she asked. I thought about the crack in the doorframe Travis had left 2 weeks earlier. About a 9-year-old girl's voice on an old iPad, shaking, but clear. About a folder that held 30 years of everything I had built. "The courthouse," I said. "Everything that is left happens at the courthouse." She did not let go of my shoulder. And I knew the hardest part had not been tonight. The hardest part was what waited inside that courtroom. Truths that had not been spoken. And a young woman in Memphis who did not yet know that the case she had been working on for 8 months was the closest she had ever come to finding where she came from. That night was not the beginning. To understand what brought them to my office at 2:38 in the morning, I need to take you back 32 years, to a spring afternoon when a 23-year-old man drove into Nashville with everything he owned in the back of a van that burned oil like it had made peace with the habit, and no plan beyond the certainty that he was not going to spend his life somewhere smaller than his ambitions. Nashville in the spring of 1993 smelled like wet asphalt and magnolia blossoms and the faint diesel haze that drifted off the rail yard south of Broadway. I drove in on a Tuesday afternoon with the windows down because the air conditioning had quit somewhere outside of Knoxville, and I had decided it was not worth the $40 to fix. The van was a 1984 Ford Econoline, white with rust along the wheel wells, and it burned oil with a kind of philosophical commitment that suggested the engine had simply accepted its circumstances. Everything I owned was in the back. A canvas duffel bag with 3 days of clothes. A toolbox my uncle had given me when I turned 16. A rolled-up set of drafting pencils I had ordered from a catalog and never used because I had not yet learned how. And $400 folded into the breast pocket of a denim jacket I had bought at a thrift store in Cookeville. I was 23 years old. I knew nobody in the city. I rented a room above a hardware store on Shelby Avenue for $220 a month, which left me with enough for about 3 weeks of groceries and nothing at all for the kind of emergency that young men without plans tend to attract. The room had a single window that looked out over a parking lot, a ceiling fan that wobbled at every speed, and a bathroom down the hall shared with 2 other tenants whose names I never learned because they were gone by the time I moved in. I spent my first night lying on a mattress on the floor, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of a city that did not know my name and had no reason to care that I was in it. I remember thinking that I had made either the best or the worst decision of my life, and that the difference between the two was going to come down to what I did in the morning. What I did in the morning was walk to a construction site on Gallatin Road and ask the foreman if he needed an extra hand. He looked at me for about 5 seconds, looked at my boots, which were the only thing I owned that suggested I had ever done physical work, and said, "You ever frame a wall?" I told him I had. He told me to come back at 6. I did not tell him that the wall I had framed was in my uncle's garage and had taken me 3 tries. There are things a man discloses, and things a man lets his work prove instead. I spent the days carrying lumber, pulling nails, learning the grammar of residential construction from men who had been speaking it since before I was born. I spent the evenings at the Nashville Public Library on Church Street, reading architecture manuals and building codes and anything I could find about the history of the neighborhoods I was beginning to walk on my days off. East Nashville, Germantown, Lachlan Springs, blocks of Victorian houses that had been beautiful once and were now sitting behind overgrown hedges with sagging porches and windows that let in as much weather as they kept out. I looked at those houses the way some men look at unfinished sentences, like there was something inside them waiting to be said, if someone would only sit down long enough to listen. My first real job came from a woman named Mrs. Parnell on Shelby Avenue, 4 blocks from my room. She was 78 years old, lived alone, and her front porch had been pulling away from the house for 2 years. The supports had rotted through, and the county had sent her a notice saying the structure was a hazard. She could not afford the repair. I told her I would do it for the cost of materials. She looked at me the way old women in the South look at young men who offer things for free, with the precise combination of suspicion and hope that comes from a lifetime of knowing the difference between kindness and a sales pitch. She let me do it. I rebuilt that porch in 4 days. New joists, new decking, new railing. I kept the original columns because they were hand-turned, and I could see the care someone had put into them 60 years earlier. When I finished, she stood on it and pressed her foot down hard 3 times like she was testing whether the earth underneath had changed. Then she looked at me. "My neighbor Edith needs her back steps fixed," she said. That was the beginning. I met James Calloway on a Tuesday in October of 1994. A roofing contractor on Woodland Street needed help redecking a commercial building, and I had been hired as day labor. Big Jim was already there when I arrived, standing on the roof edge with his arms crossed, looking down at the street with the expression of a man who considered most of the world mildly disappointing, but was willing to give it another chance. He was 30 years old, 6'4", and built like something the city had poured and forgotten to demolish. He did not say a word to me for the first 3 hours. Then around noon, I braced a joist at an angle he had not expected, one I had read about in a library book on load distribution 2 weeks earlier. He looked at the brace. He looked at me. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Nashville Public Library," I said. "Church Street." He stared at me for a moment. Then something that might have been a smile, or might have been indigestion, moved briefly across his face. "You want to grab lunch?" he said. We ate sandwiches on the roof edge with our legs hanging over. He told me he had been a carpenter since he was 17. I told him I was teaching myself architecture from library books and building porches for elderly women who could not pay full price. He chewed his sandwich and looked out over East Nashville for a long moment. "You need a partner," he said. "Someone who knows what he is doing while you figure it out." I looked at him. "Is that an offer?" "It is if you stop bracing joists like a library book and start bracing them like a man who has done it more than once." That was Big Jim. He never said things gently when he could say them accurately instead. Our first real project together was a Victorian cottage on Woodland Street. 2 stories, 1,800 square feet. Built in 1904 and abandoned for 6 years. We bought it for $22,000 with money I had saved from 14 months of porch work and a loan Big Jim secured against his truck. We restored it in 5 months, working evenings and weekends around our day jobs. New foundation supports, rebuilt staircase, original woodwork preserved wherever the damage had not gone too deep. We sold it in 11 days. I sat in my van afterward with the check in my hand, running the math 3 times because I did not trust myself to get it right. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to make me believe I could build something larger than a porch. And building, I was starting to understand, was not just a trade. It was a language. And I was finally learning how to speak it. I met Grace on an evening in October of 1995 at Centennial Park. A local arts foundation had organized a free concert on the lawn near the Parthenon replica, and I had gone because the admission was nothing, and I had spent the day tearing out water-damaged subflooring in a duplex on Eastland Avenue and wanted to sit somewhere that did not smell like mold. The stage was a temporary platform with string lights rigged along the edges. A woman sat behind a piano that looked like it had been borrowed from a church fellowship hall. She played Chopin first, then something I did not recognize, something slower and more deliberate that moved through the park the way warm air moves through an open window. I sat on the grass and forgot about the subflooring entirely. When the set ended, I walked to the edge of the stage. She was closing the fallboard over the keys with the particular care of someone who considers a piano a living thing rather than a piece of furniture. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a blue cardigan that was too large for her, and she looked at me with the calm, direct attention of a person who has already decided whether she is interested and is simply waiting to see what you do next. "That last piece," I said. "What was it?" "Sadie," she said. "Gymnopédie number 1. Did you enjoy it?" I forgot where I was for about 4 minutes. That is either the best compliment a musician can receive, or the worst. I have not decided. She smiled. I smiled back. Her name was Grace Bellamy. She was 25 years old and taught piano at a public school in Germantown during the day, and gave private lessons 3 evenings a week to pay for a studio apartment in Lockland Springs that she described as having excellent, natural light and almost no hot water. We had dinner 4 days later at a restaurant on Broadway that was slightly beyond what I should have been spending. She ordered the catfish. I ordered whatever cost less and tried not to look at the check when it came. She noticed, because Grace noticed everything and said nothing about it. Because Grace also understood which silences were generous. By our 3rd dinner, I had told her more about my plans than I had told anyone, including Big Jim. The specific blocks in Germantown I was watching. The kind of portfolio I wanted to build over the next decade. The long view I was trying to hold on to when the short term consisted mostly of sawdust and outstanding invoices. Most people I had tried to explain this to nodded politely and changed the subject. Grace picked up a napkin and started drawing. "You are thinking about properties," she said, sketching a simple diagram with the pen she kept in her jacket pocket. "That is too small. You are not buying houses, Warren. You are buying neighborhoods. Look at what happens when you restore 3 houses on the same block instead of 1. She drew lines between boxes, arrows showing value flowing from one to the next. She had studied economics for 2 years at Vanderbilt before switching to music education, and she thought in systems the way some people think in melodies. Naturally, without visible effort. In a way that cut straight through to the thing that mattered. "You see the gaps in my thinking," I said. "Someone has to." She put the napkin down. "You build beautifully, Warren. But you plan like a man who is still surprised that anyone is paying him." She was not wrong. And she was never unkind about pointing out the places where I had not yet caught up to my own ambitions. She simply handed me the map and waited for me to read it. We married in May of 1999 in a small ceremony at a church in East Nashville. 22 guests. Big Jim stood beside me in a suit that fit him the way a tarpaulin fits a building. Grace walked down the aisle in a dress her mother had altered from her grandmother's original, and I stood there thinking I had somehow found the thing I had not known I was searching for. I was 31. She was 27. The magnolias were blooming along Fatherland Street, and the evening light through the church windows made everything look like it had been placed there on purpose. In the years that followed, Grace became the hand I did not know my work had been missing. She kept teaching. She loved it. But on Sunday mornings, She sat across from me at the kitchen table reading through contracts before I signed them. Catching the details I moved too quickly to notice. "This liability clause," she said once, sliding an acquisition agreement back across the table with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. "If the zoning board rejects the variance and you have already committed to the renovation, you are exposed on both ends. Read page 4 again before you sign." She saved me from more mistakes than I can count. And slowly, across the years that followed, the portfolio grew. 1 property became 4. 4 became 8. Residential, then commercial. Then the historic restorations in Germantown and East Nashville that became the work I cared about most. Houses that had been beautiful once and had been left to fall. I put them back together the way I believed things should be put together. Carefully. With respect for what was already there. Every blueprint in that filing cabinet represented something that had nothing to do with money. It was a morning I drove across town before sunrise to walk a property before anyone else arrived. A negotiation that ran 5 hours past when it should have ended. A night Grace looked up from a spreadsheet and said, "I think you should make the offer." The numbers hold. 14 properties. A construction company. 30 years of early mornings and late calculations and the particular exhaustion that comes from building something you believe in with a person who believes in it alongside you. And last night, my daughter stood in the middle of that office, those blueprints pressed against her chest, looking at me like I was the only thing standing between her and something she believed she deserved. But before I tell you what happened after the police left that morning, I need to go back a little further, to a hospital room on the east side of Nashville, to the morning Brooke came into this world, and to the other woman who was there that same night, in a room just down the hall, whose name I would not learn for another 28 years. Brooke came into the world on the morning of March 15th, 1997, and the sound she made rearranged everything I thought I understood about what mattered. I was standing in the delivery room at Vanderbilt Medical Center, useless in the way that fathers tend to be in those moments, holding Grace's hand too tight, and trying to remember the breathing exercises we had practiced twice, and abandoned because neither of us could keep a straight face through them. Then suddenly there was a cry. Small and furious, and absolutely certain of itself. The nurse placed her in my arms, and I looked down at this tiny, red-faced, completely outraged human being, and I wept. For the first time in my adult life, I stood in a room full of people, and let the tears come without making any effort to stop them. Nothing, in 31 years of living, had prepared me for that particular feeling. The sudden and total understanding that there was now a person in the world whose existence mattered more to me than my own. "She has your chin," Grace said from the bed. Her voice worn thin but her eyes steady and bright. "I hope that is the only thing she got from me," I said. Grace laughed, a short, exhausted sound, and held out her arms. I placed Brooke carefully, the way you handle something you are terrified of dropping, and watched Grace settle our daughter against her chest. Grace looked down at her with an expression I had never seen on anyone's face before. Complete. That was the only word for it. Like something that had been traveling a long distance, had finally arrived. We brought her home 3 days later to the house on Fatherland Street. I had spent the week before painting the nursery a pale yellow because Grace said she did not want to assume anything about colors. We spent 20 minutes in the hospital parking lot arguing pleasantly about whether the car seat was installed correctly before a passing nurse took pity on us and showed us what we were doing wrong. The early years were ordinary, in the way that only the most important things are ordinary. Brooke was loud and stubborn, and curious about everything within arm's reach. She pulled books off the low shelves and chewed on the corners. She figured out how to climb out of her crib at 16 months, and we found her sitting in the upstairs hallway at 2 in the morning, perfectly content, having a detailed conversation with no one in particular. "She gets that from you," Grace told me. "The climbing or the talking to herself? Both." I taught Brooke to ride a bicycle on Fatherland Street on a Saturday morning when she was 6. I ran beside her with one hand on the seat, block after block, until somewhere near the corner of 11th, I realized I had let go, and she had not noticed. She rode to the end of the street, turned around, and came back with her chin lifted and her eyes wide. not quite believing it. "Did you see that?" she called out. "I saw it." I called back. She rode that bicycle until the chain broke twice and the back tire went flat, so many times we stopped counting. I drove her to East Nashville Elementary on her first morning of school. She sat in the back seat very quietly the entire drive, which was unusual enough that I kept checking the mirror. "You all right back there?" I asked. "What if I don't know anyone?" "You won't. That is the whole point. By the time you come home today, you will know someone." She thought about that. "What if I don't like them? Then tomorrow you will know someone else." She got out of the car, adjusted her backpack, and walked through the front doors without looking back. That was Brooke. Once she decided to do a thing, she did it entirely. Grace taught her to cook on Sunday afternoons. The two of them stood side by side at the kitchen counter. Brooke on a step stool so she could reach. Both of them in aprons too large. Flour on everything within a 3-foot radius. I would come in from a job site and find the kitchen in a state of cheerful wreckage. Something wonderful burning slightly on the stove, and the two of them laughing at something I had missed. "Don't come in here," Grace would say. "We are working. It smells like something is on fire. It is under control." It was never entirely under control, but it was always worth eating. Those Sunday afternoons. The flour on the counter. The music Grace played when she cooked. Old Patsy Cline records that she kept on a shelf, above the refrigerator. Brooke standing on that step stool with her wooden spoon, stirring with absolute authority over whatever was in the bowl. Those are the things I think about now, not the properties, not the deals, not the blueprints. Those afternoons in the kitchen with the two of them. When Brooke was 6, she drew a house on her bedroom wall with a red crayon. It was large and lopsided, and had 17 windows, which she explained was because everyone inside needed to see outside. Below it, in careful capital letters, she had written 2 words. Daddy's house. Grace asked me if I wanted to paint over it. I did not. I left it there for 18 years. It was still there the night she came back with a crowbar. Brooke grew up knowing she was loved. I am certain of that. Whatever else has happened, whatever I have had to face in the years since, I know that part is true. She had parents who showed up, who drove 4 hours to watch her sing in a school choir competition where she came in 3rd and celebrated like she had won the whole thing. She was ours. Completely. And without question. There was nothing in those years, not a single moment, not a single conversation, that gave either of us any reason to think otherwise. We did not know. There was no reason to know. What I could not have known, what neither of us could have known, was that on the same night, Brooke came into the world. In a room just down the corridor from Grace's, another woman was giving birth, a woman whose name I would not learn for 28 years. A woman named Jolene Marsh, who in the quiet hours of that same night made a decision that would take nearly 3 decades to reach us. And when it finally did, it changed everything. 3 years before the window shattered. On an ordinary Saturday at the Nashville Farmers Market, Grace saw something that ordinary Saturdays are not supposed to contain. I was not there. I had stayed home that morning because Nathan Oakes had called the evening before about a title discrepancy on a parcel near Dickerson Pike. Routine, he said, but it needed reviewing before Monday, so I sat at the kitchen table with a folder and a second cup of coffee, while Grace knocked on Brooke's bedroom door at 10. "Brooke, get up." Market day. A long silence. Then, "It is too early, Mom. The peach vendor sells out by 9. You know that." Brooke appeared a few minutes later in a light jacket, hair still damp, phone already in hand. They drove off together down Fatherland Street, the same way they had 100 Saturday mornings before. The Nashville Farmers Market in October runs long and easy. The stalls stretch along the covered pavilion near the Bicentennial Mall. Jars of local honey, braided herb bundles, sweet potatoes stacked in wooden crates, and the bread cart near the south end that draws a line before 8:30. Grace walked it the way she always did. Unhurried, canvas bag over one shoulder. Brooke half a step behind, scrolling her phone. "Put that away," Grace said. "Just a second. You said that at the herb stall." Brooke pocketed the phone. They stopped at a table of preserves near the corner path. Fig, muscadine, pickled watermelon rind. Grace picked up a jar of blackberry preserve and turned it in the light. It was then that she saw her. A woman stood roughly 30 feet back near the edge of the crowd, where the foot traffic thinned toward the parking lot. She was not shopping. She was not eating. She was not talking to anyone or looking at any of the stalls. She was watching Brooke, not a passing glance. Not the momentary notice a stranger gives someone in a crowd. She was watching her the way a person watches something they have rehearsed in their mind. Fixed, deliberate, still in a way that had no ordinary explanation. Grace set the jar down slowly. The woman was somewhere near 50. A plain gray coat. Dark hair pulled back. No bag in her hands. She stood with her weight slightly forward, as though at any moment she might step closer. But she did not. She only watched. Grace put her hand on Brooke's shoulder. "Come look at the bread cart. I want to see if they have the rosemary loaf. You don't even like rosemary loaf. I am thinking of trying it." She steered them away without looking directly at the woman again. Only when they had moved further along the path did she glance back. The woman was gone. That night, after Brooke went upstairs, Grace opened a fresh notebook. Small, blue, the kind she used for household lists. She wrote on the first blank page the date, the time, the location, a physical description, and 2 photographs she had taken from hip level while pretending to check her phone. She told herself she would investigate quietly, that it was probably nothing, that she would tell me when she had something solid to say. She never said a word. Not that night. Not across any of the quiet evenings that followed. I only found out later, when later had already become too late to matter in the way I wished it had. 2 weeks after that market morning, Brooke came into my study on a Tuesday evening. I was reviewing a property summary and barely looked up when she leaned against the doorframe. "Dad, where do you keep my birth certificate?" "The original." "What do you need it for?" "Updating some account paperwork." I set my pen down. "Could be in the filing cabinet or the storage boxes upstairs." "I will look this weekend." She nodded. "No rush. Just let me know." She pushed off the doorframe and walked back down the hall. I turned back to the summary and forgot about it before she reached the stairs. I did not know that the question had already planted something in Brooke's mind, a small seed of doubt that had no name yet but would not stop growing. I only learned her name much later. Jolene Marsh. And she had been waiting for exactly the right moment to step forward. That moment came on a Thursday evening at a place called the Broadway Lounge, a mid-sized bar off Lower Broadway with low lighting, and booths along the far wall where the noise did not carry as far. Brooke had gone out to meet a friend. The friend canceled. Brooke stayed anyway, ordered a glass of wine, and was checking her phone when the woman sat down one stool over. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but I have known who you are for a very long time." Brooke looked up. The woman was the same one Grace had photographed at the market, though Brooke had no way of knowing that. Somewhere around 50. Plain-faced, careful in how she held herself, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from years of rehearsal. "I think you have the wrong person," Brooke said. "Your name is Brooke Ashford. Your father is Warren Ashford. You grew up on Fatherland Street." The woman paused. "I am not wrong. Her name," she said, "was Jolene Marsh." She said she had spent more than 2 decades trying to find the right words. She said the hospital had been chaotic that night, understaffed, the identification system malfunctioning. She said she had made a choice no one should ever have to make. Not out of selfishness. She was very clear on that point. But out of love. "I gave you the life I could not give you myself," she said. "I watched from a distance. I made sure you were all right. And you were. You had everything." Then quietly, she added the part she had saved for last. Warren and Grace love you. I am not saying they don't, but they are not your blood. You don't owe them everything you have. You don't owe them your future. Brooke came home that night and went straight upstairs without stopping in the kitchen. I noticed. Grace noticed. We said nothing, assumed she was tired. It did not pass. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in how Brooke looked at the house, at the dining table, at me. She was quieter, more watchful. Once over dinner, I asked her if something was wrong. "I am fine, Dad," she said. "Just tired." "You have been tired a lot lately." She looked at me across the table, directly, for just a moment, then back at her plate. I said, "I am fine." Grace refilled her water glass. Neither of us pushed further. I should have pushed further. It was not dramatic, what happened to Brooke in those weeks. It was quieter than that. And quieter, I would learn, was far more dangerous. Travis Kincaid had the kind of smile that made you believe him before you thought to ask why. He entered rooms the way certain men enter rooms, with an ease that looked natural until you realized how much practice it required. I shook his hand at my own dinner table 6 months after he began dating Brooke, and what I felt was a grip that had been calibrated to communicate exactly the right amount of warmth. I mistook it for confidence. I was wrong, and I would spend a long time afterward thinking about how thoroughly I had been. Brooke met him at a property development showcase in the Gulch, the rapidly growing corridor of Nashville that developers had been reshaping for the better part of a decade. She had started attending those events on her own, which I had taken as a good sign. A daughter showing interest in the world her father had spent his life building. Travis was 35, well-dressed, an independent real estate broker who specialized in mid to high-end residential transactions. He knew how to talk to people. He knew how to listen in a way that made them feel genuinely heard. What I did not know, what I would not learn until far later, was the exact moment during that first conversation when Travis had learned whose daughter Brooke was. The moment the name landed. Ashford. Warren Ashford. And something behind his eyes had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with interest in Brooke herself. They were married the following year. I stood at the venue and shook his hand at the reception. Brooke stood beside him in the light from the tall windows, looking happier than I had seen her in months, and I told myself the distance I had felt from her over the past year was simply the natural pulling away that daughters do when they build lives of their own. I did not know that by the time I let go of Travis's hand, he had already begun to calculate. 4 months before he proposed, Travis had driven to Atlanta. Not for a client meeting. Not for an industry event. He went to a law office on Peachtree Street, a mid-sized practice that handled estate planning, property litigation, and elder law. He had done his research. He knew that one of their associate attorneys had recently written a paper on conservatorship proceedings in Georgia and Tennessee, the legal mechanisms for taking control of another person's financial affairs when that person is found incapable of managing them independently. Her name was Sophie Langford. She was 27 years old, 3 years into her practice, and she specialized in estate and property law. Under Tennessee's conservatorship statutes, a court can appoint an individual to manage another person's assets when that person is deemed legally incapacitated. It is a legitimate tool designed to protect vulnerable adults. It is also, in the wrong hands, one of the more effective instruments for stripping a competent person of everything they own. Travis sat across from Sophie and described a hypothetical case. An elderly relative making impulsive financial decisions. Family concerns. He asked the standard questions and gave answers smooth enough to keep things productive. Sophie listened. She explained the requirements, the burden of proof, the probate process, and if the petition were granted, Travis asked, "What does the conservator have access to?" "All financial accounts, real property, investment assets," Sophie said. "Full administrative control." Travis smiled and made a note. He left that afternoon with detailed legal guidance. What he did not leave with was any suspicion from Sophie. That came 8 days later. Sophie had a habit of cross-referencing property addresses mentioned in consultations against public county records. The address Travis had described appeared in Davidson County records under the name Warren M. Ashford. She ran the name. Warren Ashford was 53 years old, a long-established builder and developer in Nashville, with no public record of cognitive impairment, no medical filings, and no existing legal proceedings. He was, by every available indicator, a fully functioning individual. The gap between what Travis had described and what the public record showed was not a gap that could be explained by legitimate family concern. Sophie picked up the phone and called Douglas Webb. Douglas was 62, a former litigator who now served as legal counsel to a small roster of long-term clients in Nashville. Sophie did not know him personally, but his name was attached to Warren Ashford's business filings as attorney of record. "Mr. Webb," she said, "my name is Sophie Langford. I am an attorney in Memphis. I need to flag something regarding one of your clients, and I want to be careful about how I do it." There was a pause. "I am listening," Webb said. That phone call was not something I knew about at the time. While I was reviewing renovation contracts and Grace was quietly filling another page in her blue notebook, a woman I had never heard of was sitting in an office in Memphis making a decision that would alter the course of everything. What Travis had already done by then was worse than what he was planning. 3 weeks before that Atlanta consultation, he had arranged a meeting with his cousin Bryce Kincaid, a man who operated on the outer edges of legitimate finance. Bryce was 40, unmarried, and owed Travis favors he preferred not to discuss in detail. Using a forged signature, Travis had placed a mortgage lien on a residential property I owned on the east side of Nashville. The lender was a private hard money firm that asked few questions when paperwork looked clean. The amount drawn was $420,000, wired to an LLC registered in Delaware under a name with no visible connection to either Kincaid. That was not the ceiling of his ambition. Through 14 emails exchanged over 11 months, Travis had been negotiating with a senior acquisitions director at Meridian Development Group, a commercial firm headquartered in Charlotte with holdings across Tennessee and the Carolinas. Travis had represented himself as the authorized agent for the Warren M. Ashford property portfolio. He had provided assessments, title histories, on 7 parcels, and a proposed aggregate sale price of $20 million. The most recent email from Meridian read, "We are prepared to move forward, pending submission of the conservatorship order. Please advise on timeline." He had sold everything I owned. All that remained was legal authority to sign on my behalf, which the conservatorship was designed to provide. I did not know any of this. Not yet. What I knew was that Douglas Webb called me 2 days after Sophie's call. He did not tell me everything. He told me enough. Someone had been asking questions about my estate, and I needed to start paying closer attention to what was happening around me. I did not know Sophie's name. I did not know her face. But whatever had made her pick up that phone, instead of simply closing the file, that single decision changed everything. And she had no idea that the man she was protecting had spent 28 years grieving a daughter he did not know he had lost. In the middle of all the cold calculations of adults, there was a 9-year-old girl who was supposed to be sleeping. That was the part no one accounted for. I want to tell you about Emmy before I tell you what she did, because what she did only makes sense when you understand who she was. Emmy Kincaid was 9 years old in the winter of 2024. She had her mother's dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth that she had not yet grown into. She wore her hair in 2 braids most mornings, though they were rarely even, because the housekeeper Travis had hired was the one who did them each day before school. Brooke was usually still in her robe when Emmy left. Travis was usually not home at all. Their house on the north side of Nashville was large and well-furnished and full of things that cost a great deal and meant very little. There was a television in every room. There was a playroom with toys still in packaging from the previous Christmas. There was a kitchen where almost nothing was cooked, and a dining table that seated 8 where the 3 of them rarely sat together. Emmy was not unhappy in the way unhappy children usually are. She did not cry often. She did not complain. She had simply learned, very early, to find her warmth elsewhere. She found it at our house. Every other weekend, Grace would call Brooke on a Friday afternoon and ask if Emmy could come stay. Brooke always said yes without much discussion. Travis said nothing at all. By 5, Emmy would appear at our front door with a small bag and that gap-toothed smile. And the house on Fatherland Street felt different the moment she walked in. Grace kept a drawer in the kitchen stocked with the things Emmy liked. The particular brand of apple juice she preferred. The mini chocolate chips for the cookies they made together on Saturday mornings. They had a routine. Emmy stood on a step stool beside the counter. Grace measured. Emmy poured. Flour first, then sugar. Then the chocolate chips straight from the bag, with significantly more than the recipe called for. Grace always pretended not to notice. "Grandma Grace," Emmy said one Saturday, pressing cookie dough flat with her palm the way Grace had shown her. "Do you think cookies taste better when 2 people make them?" "I think most things do," Grace said. Emmy considered this carefully. "Even buildings?" "Especially buildings." Emmy seemed satisfied and went back to pressing. On Sunday mornings, I took her to the construction site. The church. The community church. I had been building on a lot in East Nashville for nearly 2 years. Pro bono. No fee. A piece of land the neighborhood association had secured through a county grant. And a building I had designed myself on evenings at the kitchen table while Grace read beside me, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet. Emmy loved the site. Not the way children love playgrounds, with noise and motion, but the way certain children love places where something is being made. She walked the unfinished floors in her small boots and looked up at the exposed framing with an expression of serious concentration. "Grandpa Warren," she said one morning, standing beneath a half-finished archway. "Do buildings have feelings?" "The good ones do," I said. She nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. She carried a sketch pad with her every visit and sat on an overturned bucket near the south wall, drawing what she called her blueprints. They were not architecturally accurate. They were better than that. They were the drawings of a child who understood that a building was not just walls and a roof, but something people were supposed to feel safe inside. I called her Little Architect. She called me Grandpa Warren. Neither of us ever switched to anything else. The night it happened was a Wednesday in late January. Travis came home after 11. I only know the details because Emmy told me later, in pieces, the way children tell things. Not all at once, but in small, careful disclosures, each one offered as though she was testing whether it was safe to continue. She had been in bed but not asleep. She heard the front door. Then voices in the hallway below. Travis first, low, then louder. Then Brooke, sharper than usual. "Your buildings. Your land. Nobody can stop us now." Emmy said she pulled her blanket up and lay very still, the way she had learned to do when the voices downstairs got loud. She did not understand all of it. She understood enough. She understood it the way children understand things, not through reasoning but through the stomach. Through the particular quality of silence that follows raised voices when the people raising them remember there is a child upstairs. She reached for the old iPad on her nightstand. The one Brooke had given her when the screen cracked and a newer model arrived. Emmy opened the voice recorder. She pressed the red button. She held the iPad near the gap at the bottom of her door, and she recorded for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The voices stopped. Doors closed. The house went quiet. Emmy lay awake for a long time. The following Saturday, she arrived at our house with her small bag and her uneven braids and behaved exactly as she always did. Cookies with Grace, cartoons in the afternoon. She asked me twice about the progress on the church. I noticed nothing different. That was how well she held it. Sunday morning, I took her to the site. We stood inside the nave, the framing almost complete now. The autumn light coming through the spaces where the windows would eventually go. Emmy reached into her jacket and pulled out the iPad. She held it toward me with both hands. "Grandpa Warren," she said. Her voice was smaller than usual. Daddy said bad things about your buildings. I recorded it because I did not know what else to do. Please don't be mad at me for telling. I took the iPad. I pressed play. Travis's voice filled the unfinished church, sharp and certain between the bare studs. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I listened to every word. Then I looked at Emmy. Her eyes were wet. Her chin was steady. She was 9 years old, and she had just done the bravest thing I had witnessed in a very long time. I knelt down and held her. I did not say anything for a while, because there was nothing adequate. She pressed her face against my shoulder, and I felt her breathing slow. The way a child's breathing slows when they have finally handed something heavy to someone they trust. That evening, after I drove Emmy home and watched her walk through the front door with her small bag, I sat in my office on Fatherland Street in the dark for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Big Jim at 11 at night. Not because I was afraid, but because a 9-year-old girl had just shown me that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is tell the truth, even when they are afraid of what happens next. The following morning I met Big Jim at a coffee shop on 12th Avenue South called Frothy Monkey. 6 in the morning. The place was narrow with exposed brick and 4 small tables near the window. At that hour there were 2 other customers, both with their heads down over laptops. Big Jim was already there when I arrived, black coffee in front of him, coat still on. He looked exactly the way he always looked, like a man who had never once in his life been surprised by anything and was not planning to start. I sat down and told him everything. I started with Emmy's recording and worked backward through what Douglas had told me, what Nathan Oakes had mentioned 3 weeks earlier about unusual title searches on my properties, and what I had been quietly assembling in my own head since the night. Brooke looked at me across the dinner table, and then looked away too quickly. I talked for nearly 20 minutes. Big Jim did not interrupt once. When I finished, he picked up his coffee and held it in both hands the way a man holds something when he needs a moment to decide what to say. "How long do you need?" he asked. "Long enough to be certain. Then I will start today." He moved into the guest room at the end of the upstairs hall that same evening. Duffel bag on the bed. No questions about how long he would be staying. No questions about anything at all. He ate breakfast with us each morning and was mostly quiet about it. He had done protective work before, the kind that does not involve uniforms or badges but does involve a man who sleeps lightly and knows how to read a room before he enters it. He did not treat it as unusual, which made it easier for Grace to treat it as ordinary. In the first week, Big Jim began surveillance on Travis. He did not follow him the way people in movies follow people. He simply placed himself in positions where Travis's routines became visible. 2 meetings at a restaurant on West End Avenue, with a man later identified as Bryce Kincaid. 1 meeting in a parking structure near the convention center. No documents exchanged in the open. Careful, but not careful enough. Big Jim photographed all 3 meetings from distance. In the second week, I had 16 security cameras installed throughout the house. This was not the modest system we had kept for years. A couple of units at the front entrance and the driveway. This was a full replacement. Exterior coverage on all 4 sides. Interior cameras at each entry point. And a dedicated unit aimed directly at the filing cabinet in my office. All of it wired to encrypted cloud storage with a backup server that Douglas's paralegal managed off-site. Travis came to dinner that Friday and poured himself a second glass of bourbon and looked around the room with those easy, unhurried eyes. He did not notice a single camera. In the third week, I spent 2 afternoons at Douglas Webb's office on Church Street. Douglas was 64, the kind of attorney who had seen enough to be unsurprisable. He reviewed what I had. He listened to what Big Jim had found. He pulled the county records on the East Side property and confirmed the lien that should not have existed. "You need someone to trace the financial transfers," he said. "Not me. A forensic accountant. Someone who reads shell companies the way I read a deed of trust. Do you have someone?" "A woman I have used twice before. Former FBI Financial Crimes Division. Name is Marlene Cassidy. She is thorough, and she does not stop when it gets complicated." I told him to make the call. That same week, I transferred 3 properties, the 2 parcels on the south side and a commercial unit in Germantown, into Grace's name, through a notarized deed of gift, filed with the Davidson County Register of Deeds, every signature witnessed, every document clean, perfectly legal and entirely beyond Travis's reach. In the 4th week, Nathan Oakes called from First Tennessee Bank. Nathan had managed my commercial accounts for 12 years. He was careful with words, but his meaning was clear. "Warren," he said, "I have seen inquiry activity on your holdings, external requests, title searches, lien history, assessed values on 3 of your parcels. I don't know who is pulling them, but I thought you should be aware." I thanked him and called Big Jim before the day was out. That same week, Claire Donovan came to our house on a Wednesday evening. I was not home. Grace answered the door. Claire was 35. A former colleague of Brooke's, from a property management firm where Brooke had worked briefly before her marriage. She stood on the front porch for a moment before speaking, as though she was still deciding whether to stay. "I need to tell you something," Claire said. "And I need you to understand that I did not know how far it would go." She came inside. Grace made coffee. Claire explained that approximately 8 months earlier, Brooke had offered her $15,000 to provide a signed statement attesting that she had personally observed Warren behaving erratically on several occasions. Claire had agreed. She had taken $5,000 as an advance. Then the months passed, and the situation grew more serious than Brooke's description had suggested. "I have not signed anything," she told Grace. "And I am not going to. But I thought someone should know." Claire left the advance money on the kitchen table on her way out. Grace told me about her that evening. Her voice was level and precise. When she finished, she walked to the hallway closet and came back with the blue notebook. 3 years of entries. Dates. Times. Locations. Descriptions. 13 sightings. Photographs printed and taped carefully to the relevant pages. 3 years of watching a woman watch our daughter. Documented with the quiet discipline of a person who understood that some truths require evidence before they can be spoken. She set it on the table between us. 3 years, she said. I have been watching that woman for 3 years. I opened the notebook. The first entry was dated 3 years earlier. Nashville Farmers Market. A Saturday morning. A physical description. 2 photographs taken from hip level. Below them, in Grace's careful handwriting, a single line. She was not browsing. She was watching Brooke specifically. I looked up at Grace. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I did not want to frighten you over something I could not prove." She paused. I kept thinking I would know more soon. I never knew more. I closed the notebook and kept it. Throughout all 5 weeks, I had dinner with Travis and Brooke every Friday. I laughed at his jokes. I refilled his glass when it ran low. I asked about his work with the interest of a father-in-law who trusts the man at his table. And every time Travis looked at me with that perfect smile, I thought only one thing. He was walking into the trap one step at a time. I chose a Friday evening. I cooked brisket the way Brooke had loved it since she was small. Low and slow on the smoker for 6 hours. Tennessee hickory. The bark set just right. I brushed the sauce on in the last 20 minutes so the edges caramelized without burning. I set the table the same way I had for every family dinner across 30 years. The good plates. Cloth napkins. 2 candles Grace lit while I carried the dishes out. She watched me from the kitchen doorway without speaking. We had talked through this evening twice, what I would say. In what order, what I would not. She had asked once if I was sure. I told her I was. She nodded and did not ask again. Travis and Brooke arrived at 7. Travis came in the way he always did. Jacket over one arm, handshake firm. A comment about traffic on Gallatin Road, wrapped in a light laugh. He picked up the bourbon he had brought the month before, poured himself a glass without waiting to be asked. Brooke kissed me on the cheek at the door. Her eyes were tired the way they had been for months, but she smiled when she smelled the brisket. It was always your favorite, I said. Still is, she said. Dinner lasted an hour and 10 minutes. Travis talked about a mixed-use development on the south side. He used words like momentum and positioning and long-term upside. He refilled his glass twice. He was relaxed the way men are relaxed when they believe they are the most informed person in the room. Grace asked about Emmy's school. Brooke said she was doing well and had been asking for a dog. We had dessert. Grace's peach cobb list as to servings, and complimented her baking in the way his compliments always landed, slightly short of genuine, performing instead of speaking. When the plates were cleared, I reached beneath my chair and placed the folder on the table. Standard manila, 2 inches thick. Binder clip. I set it where the serving dish had been and opened it without rushing. I laid the documents out, one at a time. Each one flat. Each one facing Travis. Bank statements first. 11 transactions, each below $9,500, routed through Kincaid Consulting Partners over 8 months. Marlene's summary total circled in blue pen, $1.4 million. Then the deed of trust bearing my forged signature. The lien on the East Side property. Release documents showing where the $420,000 went. And the 14 emails between Travis and the acquisitions director at Meridian Development Group. Proposed sale price on the 3rd page. $20 million. The word pending in the final response. Travis looked at the papers. His expression did not collapse. Men like Travis do not collapse immediately. They calculate. I watched the arithmetic move behind his eyes. Whatever you think you are seeing here, he started. I don't think, I said. I know. I kept my voice low. Not because I was uncertain, but because I had learned that the most effective way to say a serious thing is to say it quietly. I went through each document. The LLC. Delaware registration. Bryce's roll. The forged deed. Meridian correspondence. The conservatorship consultation that failed when the attorney on the receiving end made a phone call instead of closing the file. I did not mention Sophie's name. I did not mention Rex, or the hospital footage, or Jolene Marsh. I gave him exactly what he needed to understand, that the architecture he had spent 2 years building had been fully mapped. Travis pushed his chair back and stood, both hands on the table. Not anger exactly. The expression of a man watching a door he was counting on close permanently. We are your family, he said. Everything we did for our future. For Brooke. For Emmy. You stopped being family, I said, the day you made me a target. The candles flickered from the draft of his movement. Brooke had not spoken since I opened the folder. She sat with her hands in her lap, her face doing something complicated and unresolved. Her eyes were wet, not the soft wetness of remorse. The sharp wetness of a person who has just understood the full scale of what she has been part of. Brooke, I said. She looked at me, opened her mouth once and closed it, then looked at the table. I did not push. There was nothing she could have said that would change what came next. Travis picked up his jacket. He looked at me one more time, then walked to the front door and hit it open with the flat of his hand hard enough that the frame cracked at the upper corner. The sound went through the house like a punctuation mark at the end of something that had been building for years. Brooke stood. She followed him without looking back. Car doors. Engine. Tires pulling faster down the driveway than the neighborhood warranted. Grace came to the doorway beside me. October air through the open door. The crack in the frame, letting in a thin line of cold. We watched the taillights reach the end of Fatherland Street and disappear. She put her hand on my arm. I looked at the crack in the doorframe. I thought about what Douglas had told me. About a 9-year-old girl's voice on an iPad. About 30 years of blueprints in a filing cabinet that someone believed they could simply take. A man like Travis Kincaid cornered did not stop. He did not reconsider. He recalculated. And a man recalculating under that kind of pressure, $2.4 million owed, a deadline closing, every legal avenue gone, was not going to sit quietly and accept what had happened at my dinner table. He was going to do something desperate. Before I tell you about that night, I need to know you are still with me. Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just the number. That is all. It tells me you are here. And it means more than you know. And a quick note. The story ahead contains some elements shaped for reflection and meaning. If that is not for you, no hard feelings. But if you are staying, what happens next changes everything. Rex Thornton called on a Tuesday morning and said 3 words. I found it. Then he gave me an address on 2nd Avenue and a time, 2 in the afternoon, and hung up before I could ask a single question. That was Rex. He had spent 30 years in private investigation and had long since stopped believing that important things benefited from preamble. I brought Grace. We arrived at his office at 10 minutes before 2. The room was on the 2nd floor above a boot shop, practical and spare. 2 client chairs. A desk. A laptop connected to a monitor large enough to display documents without making anyone lean forward. Rex was 59. Lean, with the economy of movement that comes from a career spent watching other people without being watched in return. He shook our hands and asked if we wanted water. We both said no. I am going to show you something before I explain it, he said. I want you to see it first. Then I will walk you through what it means. He turned the monitor toward us and pressed play. The footage was gray and slightly degraded at the edges. The timestamp in the lower right corner read March 15th, 1997, 11:30 p.m. The location was a corridor in the newborn wing of Vanderbilt Medical Center, a section that had since been renovated but which in 1997 held the nursery observation room between 2 recovery wards. Rex had found it through a retired medical technician named Harold Voss, who had been part of the team that digitized the hospital's security archive in 2019. Voss had retained a personal backup of the files, a practice not authorized but not uncommon among technicians who had spent careers watching institutions discard things they later wished they had kept. The footage showed a hallway. At 11:30, a figure appeared from the left of the frame, a woman in her mid-20s wearing a hospital gown, moving with the careful slowness of someone who had recently given birth and was not supposed to be out of bed. She stopped outside the nursery window and looked in. 2 infants in adjacent bassinets. Both girls. Both born within hours of each other. That same day. The woman stood at the window for approximately 4 minutes. Then she opened the nursery door. The room was unmanned. Shift. Change. Standard protocol at the time left a window of roughly 25 minutes between the night nurse's rounds. She went inside. She stood between the 2 bassinets. She looked at both infants. Then she picked up the infant, in the right bassinet, held her briefly, and set her in the left. She picked up the infant from the left bassinet and held her against her chest. She did not leave immediately. She stood for nearly a full minute, looking down at the child she had just placed in the other bassinet. Her expression, even through the degraded footage, was readable in the way certain human expressions are readable, regardless of image quality. Not anguish. Not hesitation. Calculation. Conclusion. The face of a person who has decided and is waiting for the deciding to feel finished. Then she walked out of the frame. Rex paused the footage. The room was very quiet. The infant she left behind, Rex said, was her own biological daughter, who she placed in the Ashford bassinet. The infant she carried back to her room was your biological daughter, Mr. Ashford, the healthy Doyle child. He paused. 3 days later, she surrendered your daughter at the gate of a church in East Nashville. The intake record describes the infant as approximately 72 hours old. No identification. No note. Grace made a sound beside me. Not a word. Not exactly a cry. The kind of sound that comes before both. I turned and she was already leaning into me, her shoulders shaking with the quiet rhythm of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has run out of the strength to hold it. I put my arm around her. I pressed my hand against the back of her head. I felt something behind my own eyes that I had not felt in years. A pressure. A sting. The particular grief that has no clean shape because it belongs to something you did not know you had lost. Rex waited. When Grace's breathing had steadied, I looked up. There is one more thing, he said. Your biological daughter. I know where she is. He placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. A name and an address. Then he said one sentence that took me several seconds to fully understand. She is already in this case, Mr. Ashford. She has been for months. I looked at the paper. The name printed on it was Sophie Langford. Below it, a Memphis address and a phone number. Below that, in Rex's careful handwriting, 3 lines. Estate and property attorney. Retained by Douglas Webb. Currently co-counsel on your defense. I looked up at Rex. 3 years ago, he said, a young attorney walked into my office and placed an intake record from a children's home on my desk. A female infant. March 1997. Abandoned at a church gate. She had been searching for 10 years. He folded his hands. Your wife's notebook gave me the face. The face gave me the name. Jolene Marsh. And Jolene Marsh gave me the second birth record from that night. The one that matched yours. 2 investigations running in parallel had converged on the same point. The same hospital. The same night. The same corridor. She was protecting you before either of you knew she existed, Rex said. Grace's hand found mine. She held it tighter than she had during the footage. Her eyes were still red, but something was in them, now that I had not seen in a long time. Something quiet and luminous that had no business existing in the middle of everything we were carrying. I felt something in my chest that I did not have a word for. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Not joy, though that was there too. Something older. The sensation of understanding that a loss you believed was permanent had been slowly working its way back toward you through choices made by a person you had never met. What would you like me to do next? Rex asked. I looked at Grace. She looked at me. Not yet, I said. Wait until the trial. I need her there as our attorney, before she knows anything. Rex studied me for a moment. Then he nodded once. Understood. I have told you how the dinner ended. I have told you about the doorframe Travis cracked on his way out, how the October air slipped through the gap like a warning. What I have not told you is what happened in the 17 days between that dinner and the night the window shattered. Travis did not call. Brooke did not call. The house on Fatherland Street went quiet. In a way I had never known it to be quiet. Grace still played Sadie in the front room each evening, but the notes felt slower, as though even the piano understood something was coming. Big Jim stayed in the guest room, his boots by the back door, his phone charged to full every night. Douglas Webb checked the cameras remotely each morning at 6:15 and each evening at 9. Marlene Cassidy continued assembling her forensic report in a rented office on Church Street, working from bank records, wire transfers, and shell company filings that now filled 4 storage boxes. I kept building. That is what I have always done when the world presses against me. I went to the East Nashville church site every morning at 7, checked the framing, reviewed the plans with the crew, and came home by 4. I ate dinner with Grace. I read before bed. I did not drink. I did not pace. I waited. Because I had learned a long time ago that a man who builds for a living knows the difference between patience and hesitation. On October the 14th, Nathan Oakes called from First Tennessee Bank. A wire transfer request for $612,000 had been submitted against the Germantown commercial property, using a power of attorney dated 3 months earlier. The signature on the power of attorney was mine. I had never signed it. Nathan flagged the request and froze the account within 40 minutes. Douglas filed a fraud report with the Davidson County District Attorney's Office that same afternoon. Travis was running out of time. His debt to the crypto syndicate, $2.4 million, according to Marlene's latest estimate, was overdue by 61 days. The Meridian development deal required clear title to my properties, and every title was now either frozen or transferred to Grace. I imagine he sat in his North Nashville living room, calculating what he had left, and arrived at one answer: the original blueprints, contracts, and architectural plans locked in my office filing cabinet. Those documents, if altered or destroyed, could delay litigation long enough for him to complete at least one fraudulent sale. It was not a good plan. It was the plan of a desperate man. At 2:38 in the morning on October the 21st, I heard the sound. You already know the sound. I described it to you at the beginning of this story, the specific, deliberate crack of glass, breaking not from wind or accident, but from a tool swung with purpose. I was awake before the second piece hit the hardwood. Grace reached for my arm in the dark. I placed my hand over hers and whispered, "Stay here." Lock the door behind me. Big Jim was already in the hallway. He wore a flannel shirt and work boots, and his phone screen showed a green line connecting to the Davidson County emergency dispatcher. He had called at 2:30, 14 seconds after the window broke. He held up one finger 1 minute for the nearest patrol unit. I moved through the hallway the way I have moved through every house I have ever built. By memory. I knew the width of each door frame, the creak in the fourth floorboard from the staircase, the angle of the banister where it curved toward the lower landing. I did not need light. I needed only to reach the switch at the bottom of the stairs. When I flipped it, the hallway filled with warm yellow light, and every sound in the house stopped. Travis was kneeling beside my filing cabinet. The bottom drawer was open. A crowbar lay on the floor next to his right knee, its tip still wet with window putty. Brooke stood behind him, holding a stack of folders against her chest. Her eyes met mine first. She did not speak. She did not move. I looked at Travis. He looked at the crowbar, then at me, then at the red light of the nearest camera, mounted above the office doorframe. I watched him understand. 16 cameras, I said. Every angle. Cloud stored. Encrypted. Douglas Webb has had access since the day you cracked my doorframe. Travis stood slowly. Brooke set the folders on my desk without a word. Outside, blue and red lights swept across the front windows. Detective Paula Reeves entered through the front door at 2:42. 4 minutes and 22 seconds after Big Jim's call. She was followed by 2 uniformed officers. She read Travis his rights first. Then Brooke. She asked me to confirm the surveillance system, and I handed her Douglas's notarized camera installation affidavit and a USB drive containing the previous 4 hours of footage. Travis said nothing as they let him out. Brooke paused at the front door. She turned, and for a moment I thought she might say something, an apology, an explanation, anything at all, but she only looked at the hallway light, the one I had switched on, and then she walked to the patrol car. Grace came downstairs after the cars left. She stood beside me on the porch, her robe pulled tight, her breath visible in the October air. The cracked door frame was still there, unmended. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked at the street. The red taillights had disappeared past the Shelby Avenue intersection. The neighborhood was dark again, and somewhere a dog barked twice, and then went quiet. "The courthouse," I said. Grace nodded. She did not ask when. She did not ask if I was ready. She had spent 30 years beside a man who built things for a living, and she knew the answer to both. I stood on that porch until the sky turned gray above the Cumberland River, and I thought about a courtroom I had never entered. A woman named Sophie Langford I had never met, and a secret that had waited 28 years to be spoken aloud. The hardest part was not the break-and-in. The hardest part was what came next. Marlene Cassidy did not look like a woman who had spent 11 years inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She was 5'4", wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and carried her files in a canvas tote bag she had bought at a craft fair in Franklin. But when she opened that bag and laid its contents across the conference table in Douglas Webb's office on Church Street, every person in the room understood why the Bureau had trusted her with cases worth 9 figures. It was October the 29th, 8 days after the break-in. Warren sat at the head of the table. Grace sat beside him, her hands folded over a yellow legal pad she had brought but never opened. Big Jim leaned against the window ledge with his arms crossed. Douglas Webb stood near the projector, adjusting the screen. And Marlene stood at the front of the room with 4 storage boxes behind her and a single manila folder in her hand. "I want to walk you through everything," she said. "Start to finish. No shortcuts. Because what I found is worse than what you think." She began with the LLC. Kincaid Consulting Partners had been registered in Delaware on March the 11th, 2 years earlier. The registered agent was a mailbox service in Wilmington. The sole member listed was not Travis Kincaid but a name none of them recognized. David Parrish. Marlene had traced David Parrish to a former college roommate of Travis, who now lived in Boca Raton, Florida, and who, according to his own bank records obtained through subpoena, had received a single payment of $8,000 for the use of his name and social security number. He probably thought it was a consulting gig, Marlene said. He had no idea his identity was attached to $1.4 million in fraudulent transactions. She clicked to the next slide. 11 wire transfers, each below the $10,000 reporting threshold, had moved from Warren's accounts into Kincaid Consulting Partners over a 14-month period. The amounts ranged from $6,200 to $9,400. Each transfer carried a forged authorization bearing Warren's signature. Marlene placed 2 documents side by side on the screen: Warren's genuine signature from a notarized property deed and the forged version from the wire transfer forms. The differences were subtle: a slightly wider loop on the W, a fractional lift between the R and the E, but under magnification they were unmistakable. "Bryce Kincaid prepared these," Marlene said. "Travis's cousin. He has a background in mortgage processing. He knew exactly how much detail a bank reviewer checks and how much they skip." The total moved through Kincaid Consulting Partners was $1,412,000. Of that amount, Marlene had traced $640,000 to a hard money lender in Atlanta who had provided Travis a short-term loan against the forged lien on the East Side property. Another $320,000 had been converted to cryptocurrency through 3 separate exchanges and then withdrawn in cash at a Bitcoin ATM network in Memphis. The remaining $452,000 sat in a standard checking account at a regional bank in Bowling Green, Kentucky, untouched. "He kept that account as an emergency fund," Marlene said, "in case he needed to run." She paused and removed her glasses. "Now the part that concerns me most." Marlene opened the second box and produced a stack of printed emails. These were the 14 messages between Travis and the acquisitions director at Meridian Development Group that Warren had already seen at the dinner. But Marlene had obtained, through Douglas's subpoena, an additional 31 emails that Travis had deleted from his account. Those messages revealed that the proposed $28 million sale was not merely pending. Meridian had already deposited $500,000 into an escrow account at a Cayman Islands bank, contingent on Travis delivering clear title to all 14 properties within 90 days. The 90-day window opened on September the 1st, Marlene said, which means it closes on November the 29th. 5 weeks from today. Grace wrote the date on her legal pad. It was the first thing she had written all morning. Marlene continued. Travis's total personal debt, including the failed cryptocurrency venture, the hard money loan interest, and what Marlene described as obligations to private creditors whose names she was still verifying, stood at approximately $2.4 million. He had no income apart from a modest salary at a property management firm in Brentwood, which he had stopped attending 3 months earlier. His North Nashville house carried a mortgage with 4 missed payments. Brooke's name was on neither the mortgage nor any of the fraudulent accounts. She knew. Warren said quietly. She was present, Marlene replied. Whether she knew the details or only the intent is something the court will have to decide. Douglas stepped forward and turned off the projector. He laid a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a summary. 11 forged transfers totaling $1.4 million. A fraudulent lien of $420,000. A Cayman escrow of $500,000. A 90-day deadline, and a total debt of $2.4 million. At the bottom, Douglas had written a recommended list of charges. wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, attempted grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud, and filing false instruments. Warren stared at the page. He had built 14 properties with his hands, his mind, and 30 years of early mornings. The numbers on that sheet represented not just stolen money, but stolen time hours of framing walls, reviewing blueprints, and driving to inspection sites in the rain. "File everything," Warren said. "Every charge. Every count." Douglas nodded. Marlene began packing her boxes. Grace closed her legal pad and placed her hand on Warren's forearm. Big Jim had not moved from the window ledge, but he looked at Warren and gave a single nod that carried the weight of 4 decades of friendship. Outside the office window, Church Street was busy with the ordinary rhythm of a Nashville afternoon. People walked to lunch. A bus passed. Somewhere, a guitar played through an open door. None of them knew that 5 blocks away, in a rented office above a barber shop, a woman named Sophie Langford was reviewing the same set of property records and arriving at the same conclusion from the opposite direction. She did not yet know why. She would. Soon enough. The Davidson County Courthouse sits on 2nd Avenue in the center of Nashville. A limestone building with tall windows and a flagpole that has leaned 2 degrees to the left for as long as anyone can remember. I had driven past it 1,000 times in 30 years. I had never walked through its front doors. On the morning of November the 17th, I did. Grace drove. She wore a navy dress and the pearl earrings her mother had given her on our wedding day. She had not worn them since the funeral. I wore the same charcoal suit I had worn to sign the deed on our first Germantown property in 2003. Big Jim sat in the back seat in a pressed white shirt that I suspected he had bought the day before, because I had never once seen him wear a collar that did not have sawdust on it. Douglas Webb met us on the courthouse steps at 8:45. He carried a leather briefcase that held, by his own count, 411 pages of evidence. Beside him stood Marlene Cassidy with her canvas tote bag and a calm expression that made her look as though she were arriving at a library rather than a federal courtroom. Rex Thornton waited near the side entrance, a sealed envelope in his hand that contained a USB drive with the Vanderbilt Hospital footage from 1997. "Are you ready?" Douglas asked. "I have been ready since October the 21st, I said. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. 4 rows of wooden benches on each side, a judge's bench raised 3 steps above the floor, and a witness stand with a microphone that looked older than the building. Judge Catherine Holloway presided, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back and reading glasses she never removed. She had a reputation, Douglas had told me, for patience and precision, and for asking her own questions when attorneys failed to ask the right ones. Travis sat at the defense table in a gray suit I had never seen. His attorney, Martin Adler, was a private-practice lawyer from Brentwood who specialized in white-collar defense and who, according to Douglas, had represented 2 state legislators and a hospital executive in the past decade. Brooke sat in the first row behind Travis. She wore a black blouse and looked at the floor. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Regina Hollins, a woman Douglas described as relentless and methodical. She had reviewed Marlene's forensic report twice and had requested additional documentation on the Cayman escrow, which Marlene had provided within 48 hours. Regina Hollins opened with the numbers. She stood before the jury, 8 women and 4 men, and spoke for 11 minutes without raising her voice. She described 11 wire transfers. She named the amounts. She showed the forged signatures on a screen mounted beside the jury box. She explained the Delaware LLC, the identity of David Parrish, the role of Bryce Kincaid, and the function of the hard money lender in Atlanta. She described the $420,000 fraudulent lien. She described the $500,000 sitting in a Cayman Islands escrow account. She described the 90-day deadline that would have expired on November the 20th, 12 days from today. "This is not a case about a family disagreement," she said. "This is a case about a man who married into a family for the sole purpose of dismantling it." Martin Adler's opening was shorter. He stood for 6 minutes and argued that Travis Kincaid had been a devoted son-in-law who made financial mistakes under pressure, that the wire transfers were authorized verbally, and that the signature discrepancies were the result of haste rather than intent, and that the Meridian development deal was a legitimate business opportunity that Warren Ashford had been consulted about and had initially supported. I watched the jury during Adler's statement. The woman in seat number 3 mid-Herfordies, dark hair, a teacher or a nurse, by the way, she sat with her hands still, looked at Travis once, and then looked away. The man in seat number 8 wrote something on his notepad and underlined it twice. Douglas called Marlene Cassidy as the first witness. She took the stand with her tote bag, removed a single binder, and answered questions for 47 minutes. She walked the jury through every transaction, every timestamp, every routing number. She showed the magnified signatures. She showed the deleted emails, recovered through subpoena. She showed the Cayman escrow receipt, which listed the beneficiary as Kincaid Consulting Partners, a company Warren Ashford had never heard of until 5 weeks ago. Adler cross-examined her for 22 minutes. He questioned the chain of custody on the deleted emails. He suggested the signature analysis was subjective. He asked whether Marlene had ever made an error in her 11 years at the Bureau. Marlene adjusted her reading glasses, looked at him directly, and said, "I have made errors in my life, counselor. This report is not one of them." A juror in the back row almost smiled. Nathan Oakes testified next. He confirmed the fraudulent wire transfer request of $612,000 and explained that he had frozen the account within 40 minutes of receiving it. He confirmed that the power of attorney attached to the request bore a signature inconsistent with Warren Ashford's verified records on file with the bank. Claire Donovan took the stand in the afternoon. Her voice shook. She described how Brooke had approached her at a coffee shop in East Nashville and offered her $15,000 to provide a written statement claiming that Warren exhibited signs of cognitive decline and erratic behavior. Claire had accepted the money, kept $5,000, and spent 11 days writing a statement she knew to be false before her conscience brought her to Warren's kitchen table. "Why did you come forward?" Regina asked. "Because he built my grandmother's porch for free," Claire said. "And I could not lie about a man who does that." Judge Holloway called a recess at 4:15. I stood in the hallway with Grace, and she held my hand the way she had held it on the morning Brooke was born, firmly, without trembling, as though the act of holding was itself a kind of certainty. Douglas approached us with Rex Thornton beside him. "Tomorrow morning," Douglas said. We called Jolene Marsh. I felt Grace's grip tighten. Behind us, through the courtroom doors, I could still see Brooke sitting in the front row, alone, staring at the empty witness stand as though she already knew what it would reveal. Jolene Marsh entered the courtroom at 9:12 on the morning of November the 18th. She was 59 years old, thin in a way that suggested years of missed meals rather than discipline, and she wore a brown cardigan buttoned to the collar. Her hair was gray and pulled into a braid that hung over her left shoulder. She carried nothing. She looked at no one. The bailiff swore her in. She placed her hand on the Bible and said, "I do," in a voice so quiet that Judge Holloway asked her to repeat it. She sat in the witness chair and folded her hands on the wooden rail in front of her, and I noticed that her fingernails were bitten down to the skin. Regina Hollins approached the stand slowly. She had told Douglas the night before that she intended to let Jolene speak without interruption for as long as possible, because a woman who has carried a secret for 28 years will say more in silence than she will under pressure. "Miss Marsh," Regina began, "can you tell the court your connection to Warren and Grace Ashford?" Jolene looked at the floor. Then she looked at me. It was the first time our eyes had met, and I felt something move through my chest that I could not name, not anger, not pity, but something between recognition and grief, as though I were looking at a person who had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. "I gave birth at Vanderbilt Medical Center on March the 15th, 1997, she said. "Same night as Grace Ashford. Same floor. My room was across the hall. What happened that night, Miss Marsh?" Jolene closed her eyes. When she opened them, They were wet. I was 29. I was alone. The father had left before I was showing. I had a job cleaning offices in Green Hills, and I had saved $1,100 for the hospital bill. But the birth was complicated, and I knew the bill would be more than that. I lay in that bed after they took her to the nursery, and I thought about what kind of life I could give a child. No family. No savings after the bill. A one-bedroom apartment on Dickerson Pike, with a window that did not lock. She paused. The courtroom was silent in a way I have never experienced before. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of 40 people holding their breath at the same time. At 11:30 that night, I walked to the nursery. The nurse on duty had stepped away. I do not know for how long. I stood at the window and looked at my daughter in her bassinet, and then I looked at the baby beside her. The card on the bassinet said Ashford. I had heard the nurses talking about the family earlier, the father who built houses, the mother who played piano. I thought about the yellow nursery they probably had waiting. I thought about my apartment on Dickerson Pike. "What did you do, Miss Marsh?" "I switched the bracelets," she said. I took my daughter's bracelet and placed it on the Ashford baby. I took the Ashford bracelet and placed it on mine. It took less than 30 seconds. No one saw me. No one came. I walked back to my room and lay in the dark until morning. A sound came from the first row behind the defense table. It was Brooke. She had pressed both hands over her mouth, and her shoulders were shaking. Travis stared straight ahead. Martin Adler wrote something on his legal pad without looking up. 3 days later, Jolene continued, "I was discharged with the Ashford baby. I brought her to my apartment. I fed her. I held her. I told myself I had done the right thing, that my real daughter would have a better life with the Ashfords. But by the 5th day, I could not sleep. I could not eat. I looked at that baby, and I knew she was not mine, and the weight of what I had done was heavier than anything I had ever carried." "What did you do with the child, Miss Marsh?" "On the 8th day, I drove to a church in East Nashville. I do not remember the name. I wrapped her in a clean blanket and left her on the front step at 6 in the morning. I rang the bell, and I drove away. I heard Grace inhale beside me. I reached for her hand under the table. She took it and held it so tightly I could feel her pulse against my palm." Regina turned to the screen beside the jury box. Rex Thornton's footage appeared grainy, gray-a-green, the timestamp reading the 15th of March 1997, 11:31 p.m. The nursery was dim. 2 bassinets sat side by side. A figure in a hospital gown entered from the left side of the frame, leaned over both bassinets, and moved her hands between them. The motion lasted 23 seconds. Then the figure walked out the way she had come. "Is that you in the video, Miss Marsh?" "Yes." "And the baby you left at the church? What happened to her?" "She was placed in foster care. She was adopted at 14 months by a family in Memphis named Langford." The name hit the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Douglas looked at me. Rex, seated in the 3rd row, looked at the floor. Grace turned her face toward my shoulder, and I felt her tears through the fabric of my suit jacket. "Her name," Jolene said, "is Sophie Langford. She is 28 years old. She is an attorney, and she is Warren and Grace Ashford's biological daughter." Judge Holloway removed her glasses and set them on the bench. She looked at Jolene for a long moment, then looked at me. The courtroom remained still. No one whispered. No one shifted. The only sound was the low electrical hum of the projector, still displaying the frozen image of a nursery where 2 lives had been exchanged in the dark. I sat in that chair and I understood, for the first time in 28 years, that the daughter I had raised was not my blood, and the daughter who was my blood had grown up without me. Both truths were real. Both truths hurt in ways I did not yet have language for. Brooke was looking at me now. Her hands had dropped from her mouth into her lap. Her eyes asked a question I could not answer. Not because I did not know the answer, but because the answer would take longer than a courtroom allowed. Judge Holloway spoke. We will recess for 1 hour. Counselors, my chambers, please. I did not move. Grace did not move. We sat together in that quiet courtroom while the room emptied around us, holding hands the way we had held them on the night our daughter was born. Except now, we did not know which daughter that word belonged to. When the courtroom reconvened at 1:15 that afternoon, Douglas Webb walked to the evidence table and picked up a sealed manila envelope marked Exhibit 19. He held it for a moment before handing it to Judge Holloway. She opened it, read its contents, and placed it face down on the bench without expression. "Mr. Webb," she said, "you may present this to the jury." Douglas turned to the screen. The document appeared in high resolution, a DNA paternity and maternity analysis conducted by Gen-Confirm Laboratories in Atlanta, dated November the 9th. The report contained 2 comparisons. The first compared Warren Ashford and Grace Ashford's DNA profiles to the profile of Brooke Ashford Kincaid. The result was printed in a single line. Probability of biological parentage, 0%. The second compared Warren and Grace Ashford's DNA to the profile of Sophie Langford. The result read, probability of biological parentage, 99.998%. Douglas let the jury look at the numbers in silence. He did not explain them. He did not add commentary. He stood beside the screen with his hands at his sides and allowed 30 seconds to pass before he spoke. "The defense has no objection to the authenticity of this report," he said. "It was conducted by a nationally accredited laboratory, using chain-of-custody samples collected under court supervision." Martin Adler confirmed with a single nod. He did not stand. I looked at the numbers on the screen. I had known the truth since Rex Thornton showed me the video in his 2nd Avenue office. I had carried it for 18 days. But seeing it projected on a courtroom wall, reduced to percentages and decimal points, made it feel different, clinical, and absolute, the way a building inspection report tells you a foundation has cracked and there is no ambiguity in the measurement. Grace had not looked at the screen. She was looking at the back of the courtroom, where a woman had entered quietly during the recess and taken a seat in the last row. She wore a dark blue blazer and carried a leather satchel. Her hair was brown, pulled back, and she sat with her hands in her lap in a way that reminded me of Grace at the piano, still, composed, waiting for the right moment to begin. Sophie Langford had come to the courthouse on her own. Douglas had not called her. Rex had not told her the trial date. She had found it through public records, the same way she had found the property irregularities months earlier, while working from her rented office above the barbershop on Church Street. She had sat through Jolene's testimony that morning from the hallway outside, listening through the door that the bailiff had left ajar. I did not turn around. Grace whispered, "She is here." I closed my eyes for a moment and felt something shift inside me that was larger than the courtroom, larger than the trial, larger than anything I had built in 30 years. Judge Holloway proceeded to sentencing arguments. Regina Hollins summarized the charges against Travis Kincaid: 12 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of forgery, 2 counts of identity theft, 1 count of conspiracy to commit grand larceny, and 1 count of filing false instruments. She recommended a sentence of 18 to 22 years in a federal correctional facility, restitution of all misappropriated funds, and permanent forfeiture of any claim to Ashford family assets. Martin Adler requested leniency, citing Travis's lack of prior criminal record and his cooperation during the arrest. Judge Holloway listened without interrupting, then turned to Travis. "Mr. Kincaid, do you wish to address the court?" Travis stood. He adjusted his tie. He looked at me for the first time since the trial began, and I searched his face for remorse, the way I would search a wall for a crack carefully, knowing that what I found would determine whether the structure could stand. "I made mistakes," he said. "I take responsibility." 7 words. No apology. No mention of Grace, or Emmy, or the family he had entered under false pretenses. He sat down, and the tie he had just straightened was already crooked again. Judge Holloway sentenced Travis Kincaid to 19 years and 4 months in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 12 years. Restitution was ordered for the full amount of $1.4 million, plus the return of the Cayman escrow funds. Bryce Kincaid, who had entered a plea agreement the previous week, received 4 years and 8 months. Brooke was charged separately with conspiracy and aiding fraud. Her hearing was scheduled for December. She left the courtroom without looking at anyone, and I let her go. The courtroom emptied slowly. Douglas shook my hand. Marlene nodded from across the room. Big Jim waited by the door. Regina Hollins gathered her files and paused long enough to say, "You built a solid case, Mr. Ashford." The evidence did the rest. I walked toward the back of the courtroom. Grace walked beside me. Sophie Langford stood as we approached. She was taller than I had imagined, and her eyes were the same shade of gray-green as Grace's. A detail I had not expected and was not prepared for. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "I am Sophie Langford. I believe you know who I am." "I do," I said. "I have known for 18 days. I wanted you to hear the truth from a witness stand, not from a stranger's phone call." She looked at Grace. Grace looked at her. There was a silence that lasted no more than 4 or 5 seconds. But in that silence I watched two women recognize each other in a way that went beyond evidence and percentages and laboratory reports. Grace reached out and took Sophie's hand, and Sophie led her. We walked out of the courthouse together. The November sun was low over 2nd Avenue, and the limestone glowed the way old buildings do when the light catches them at the right angle. Big Jim held the door. Douglas stood on the steps. Marlene was already gone, her canvas tote over her shoulder, walking toward Church Street. 3 weeks later, on December the 8th, I stood inside the East Nashville Community Church I had been building for 2 years. The pews were white oak. The windows let in morning light. The dedication ceremony was small 42 people. A pastor named Reverend Thomas Gaines, and a brass plaque near the entrance that read, "Built by Warren Ashford and Friends. For the neighborhood. For free." Sophie stood in the 3rd row. Grace stood beside me at the front. Emmy sat between them, holding a drawing she had made of the church with colored pencils, every window accounted for, the steeple slightly crooked, and the front door wide open. I had built this church with lumber and nails and mornings that started before the sun, but standing in it now, with the light coming through those windows, I understood that the most important thing I had ever built was not a structure at all. Winter settled over Nashville, the way it always does, quietly, without announcement, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in old window frames and reminds you where the caulk has thinned. I spent December and January repairing things. Not buildings. Not contracts. The smaller things that a man neglects when his life becomes a courtroom. I replaced the cracked door frame on the front of the house. It had been broken since the night Travis slammed it on his way out after the dinner, and I had left it untouched through the trial, as a kind of evidence I could see with my own eyes. But on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, I pulled the old frame out, measured the jamb, cut a new piece of white oak from a board I had been saving in the garage, and set it in place. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Big Jim moved out of the guest room on December the 14th. He carried his single duffel bag to his truck, shook my hand on the porch, and said, "Call me when you need a wall raised." He drove back to his cabin on Old Hickory Lake, where he had lived alone since his wife passed in 2019. I called him the following Sunday, not because I needed a wall raised, but because 40 years of friendship is itself a kind of structure, and structures require maintenance. Emmy stayed. That was not the plan. But plans have a way of rewriting themselves when a 9-year-old is involved. After Travis's sentencing, Brooke's attorney requested temporary custody transfer, while Brooke awaited her own hearing. Grace and I filed as temporary guardians through the Davidson County Family Court, and Judge Holloway approved the arrangement in 11 days. Emmy arrived on our porch with a backpack, an iPad she no longer used for recording, and a shoebox full of colored pencils. She took the small bedroom at the end of the hallway, the one that had been Brooke's. Grace repainted it a pale green that Emmy had chosen from a hardware store sample card. I built a desk for her from reclaimed pine and placed it beneath the window that faced the backyard. On her first night, she sat at that desk and drew a building I did not recognize. When I asked her what it was, she said, "It is the house I am going to build when I grow up. It has 9 rooms and a porch that goes all the way around." I pinned the drawing above my drafting table in the office, next to the lopsided house with 17 windows that Brooke had drawn on her bedroom wall 18 years earlier. 2 drawings. 2 daughters, in their own way. Both believed that a house could hold more than furniture. Sophie came to Nashville on the second Saturday of January. She parked a silver sedan on Fatherland Street at 10 in the morning and sat inside it for 6 minutes before Grace walked out and knocked on her window. I watched from the porch. Grace opened the passenger door, sat beside her, and they talked for nearly 20 minutes before either of them stepped out of the car. I do not know what they said. I did not ask. Some conversations belong only to the people inside them. Over the following weeks, Sophie visited 3 more times. She walked through the house. She stood in the kitchen, where Grace had taught Brooke to make biscuits. She touched the piano in the front room and pressed a single key. A C. The same note Grace always started with. She asked about the church, and I drove her to East Nashville to see it. She stood in the doorway for a long time, reading the brass plaque, and then she said, "You built this for strangers." I said, "I built it for the neighborhood." She looked at me and said, "Same thing." On her 4th visit, she brought a box of documents from her office property records, title searches, financial analyses she had compiled independently over the previous months while working the case from the other direction. She spread them across the dining table, and Marlene Cassidy's conclusions matched hers almost exactly. 2 women who had never met, working from opposite ends of the same thread, arriving at the same numbers. I looked at those papers and understood that Sophie had been protecting me before she knew I was her father. I did not rush the word. I did not say it on her first visit, or her second, or her third. I let the days do what days do: accumulate, overlap, build something layered enough to bear weight. On a Sunday evening in late February, Sophie and Grace and Emmy and I sat on the back porch after dinner. Emmy was drawing. Grace was humming a melody I had heard her play 1,000 times. Sophie was reading a lease agreement she had brought from Memphis, her pen moving in small circles over a clause she did not like. I looked at the 3 of them in the porch light, and I said, "Sophie." She looked up. I did not say anything else for a moment, because the sentence I wanted to speak was one I had waited 28 years to say, without knowing I was waiting. "I am glad you are here," I said. She held my gaze. She nodded once, and then she went back to her lease agreement. And Grace kept humming, and Emmy asked me how to draw a load-bearing wall. The evening continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. And perhaps that was the most extraordinary part, that after everything, after the broken glass and the courtroom and the secret that had split my life in 2 before and after, the extraordinary thing was an ordinary evening on a porch with the people I loved. I am 55 years old. I have built 14 properties, 1 construction company, 1 community church, and more porches than I can count. I arrived in Nashville in a white van with $400 and a set of borrowed tools. I did not know then what I was building. I know now. If you have read this far, I want to ask you one question. Not about buildings, not about money, not about courtrooms. I want to ask you this: who are you building for? Because one day, the blueprints will not matter, and the square footage will not matter, and the only thing that will remain is whether the people inside those walls knew they were loved. That is what I built. That is what lasts.